me how many of you remember him, know him? Okay, so most of you have come for him, for Shashi. Well, the thing with, he's the creator of the Leela Empire. I mean, Krishnan Nair is a common name, but he is the creator of the Leela Empire. And it is very interesting that he not only just built hotels, but he created dreams of palaces of luxury, where, as Bachi writes, he offers nothing but the best of the best. But, like the Roman Empire, Captain Nair's empire also overextended and collapsed. The ups and downs of Captain Nair is fascinating. But even more interesting, I think, in many ways, are his life lessons that we can learn from Captain Nair's life. So we begin now with, to discuss Captain Nair's life, we have two very interesting speakers. One, Bachi Karkaria, who is the author of the book, Capture the Dream. And she actually wrote the book after he died, so she has never met him. And we have Shashi Tharoor, who has not written this book, but he knew Captain Nair very well. So it is what we in Malayalam say, Ugran combo. That is excellent combination. So, Bachi, if I can start with you. You were commissioned by the family to write this book, and this was to commemorate his 100th birth anniversary. And you interviewed his family, his friends, his colleagues, and presented a very good portrait of the man. So we will come to his mistakes later, but if you could start with some of his outstanding qualities that transformed him from a poor boy in Kannur to international success.
Thank you, Anita, and thank you, Shashi, for being here and getting this whole crowd. Actually, Captain Nair, I think the most spectacular quality of his was his audacity. Like, everybody needs passion to build an empire. But when you have audacity combined with passion, that's what kind of makes you take a great leap forward.
I think the sound system needs to be turned up a bit, please.
Okay, so I'll repeat that. That passion is important, but to passion, if you add audacity, that is what will take you into the very next level. And right from the time that he was a young boy in school, he went up to the Chirakkal Raja Valya, who had come for the annual day, recited a beautiful poem in praise. Here he was this poor Vanya boy, and he'd seen this Raja who seemed to have come straight from the Malayalam epics. And he said this poem of praise. And the Raja was so flattered that he said, I will pay for this boy's education till the time that he wants to study. So that was the first, right from that time. Then he kind of went further and further. He kind of, VP Menon, another Kerala boy, became his patron. And that's how he had all these doors opening. When he wanted, can I continue? Yeah, all right. So I think audacity was very important. I think secondly, he never forgot his Kerala roots. And I think, when I asked his daughter, I asked his daughter-in-law that what did you learn from your father-in-law? And she didn't give me some fine hoteliering secret. She said, from him, I learned the importance of family, culture, and roots. And so he never moved away from his roots. Secondly, he never forgot his humble beginnings. And he may have had meetings with kings and his corporate managers, but his most important meeting of the day was with his malis and his doormen.
Thank you, Bachi. Shashi, you knew him well, and he was a very good friend. And one of the things that comes through in Bachi's book is that he never forgot his friends. He was very generous with them. He was very kind with them. He always said, making money is important, but making memories is equally important. Share with us some of the memorable moments that you have had with Captain Nair in good times and in bad times.
Well, oddly enough, Anita, I'm really more here as a fan of Bachi's book because it's delightfully written. It's a great story. I only knew Captain Nair in the last half dozen years of his life, which is a really shocking confession to make because he was such a larger-than-life figure here. But because he sort of became a legend when I was a humble UN official in places like New York and Geneva and Singapore, our paths didn't cross. Until out of the blue, one day a couple of handsome volumes arrived at my office in New York, sent by Captain Krishnan Nair, who had decided to republish the memoirs on the transfer of power of VP Menon at his own expense. The book was out of print. He decided he was going to revive it, and he thought, perhaps because of my notoriety by then for some of the books I'd written and so on, that I deserved to have this copy. And so he wrote to me as a complete stranger, sending me these books, and of course I wrote back thanking. And then subsequently, when I visited India, we didn't meet immediately. By, again, a simple coincidence, I was a good paying customer at the Leela Kovalam whenever I visited Thiruvananthapuram. And our paths never crossed there either. So it's a curious thing that it was entirely by accident that once he showed up to sort of visit his own hotel, and I happened to be a guest there, and that's how we first met. Subsequently, yes, I've had the great privilege of knowing him and indeed visiting him in his lovely home in Bombay, attending a couple of family events that he invited me for, and having a few conversations with him. He also invited me to inaugurate a big gathering he'd done in Kannur. This is even before I came into politics, where unfortunately I was the only speaker in English, because at that point I was much less confident about my ability to hold an audience in Malayalam. And so I had spoken on that occasion in English, and he had a galaxy of Malayali eminences speaking in Malayalam at that time. I remember all of these things. I was struck from the start, and this was by then a man in his 80s, and I was struck by the extraordinary vigor he radiated. He had so much of energy. And it was always, he seemed to be a driven person in whatever he did. In every gathering he organized, every event he held, you never got a sense that this was a man who ever thought that his age was going to hold him back. Full of vigor. And the other thing about Captain Krishnan Nair, as Bachi's already pointed out, the audacity she mentions. When I think of the way in which most Malayalis are that I've grown up amongst and that I've known, we are not risk takers by and large. You get into a good, secure job, and in his case it was the army. General Cardozo is sitting here, he knows what I'm talking about. Who leaves the army? He left it twice. It's incredible. I mean, every time he sensed a new opportunity to do something different, he would do it. He would just take the risk and go. And then he went back and joined the army again, rose to the rank of captain, had very powerful, he was a favorite of very powerful mentors in the army, but he still left in order to start a business venture. So when you think about the risks he took, you really have to feel that the gentleman was in some ways touched by a larger power, because almost everything he did at every stage of his life would have seemed objectively to anyone who may have been asked to advise him to be utter folly. But everything he did clicked until, as you pointed out, at the very end, when it didn't work out at the very end. But then everyone's sort of thread runs out at some point, and given where he started, even his failure looks like a remarkable success at the very end of his life.
I mean, you mentioned audacity, you both mentioned audacity, and that seems to be a very strong quality of his. And it's like the Jewish word chutzpah, which is kind of very hard to translate. And I'm not going to ask Shashi to translate it, because he will give us a word that we cannot understand. So
that's so unfair.
No.
Chutzpah is very simply the...
There he goes. No, I will tell what this chutzpah is, okay? ശരിക്കും മലയാളത്തിൽ പറയുകയാണെങ്കിൽ ശരിക്കും ചങ്കുറ്റി ധൈര്യം അസാമാന്യമായ ആത്മവിശ്വാസം that's and one of the key elements of this is the ability to convert weakness into strength, and that he did remarkably well. Can you tell us an example of this?
Okay. Well, shall I say the bleeding Madras? Oh.
But you hold the mic closer to you. That's definitely
right.
going to help.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm not such a practiced speaker, Shashi. So
You're a
anyway.
wonderful writer. That's all that matters at Literary Festival.
I just want to, I'll come to your question, but I wanted to say about him leaving the army, since General Cardozo is here. The reason he left the army was because he had a very, very strong, proper Malayali matriarch of a wife, Leela, who kind of made all the decisions for him. And the only career that he left was the career in the army, because she said, I don't want you to be saluting to all and sundry. So you better now leave the army. So about Bleeding Madras. So actually, Anita, that was really one of the reasons why I took on this book. You know, so he was, before he became this great hotelier, he was really a kind of a traveling salesman for his father-in-law's mill, and he was promoting fabric, handloom, and he had kind of risen pretty high because he by then had kind of seized every opportunity. So when a big importer from America, Jacobson, had come to find some fabrics, Captain Nair was introduced to him, and Captain Nair introduced to him this Bleeding Madras. And he gave all the wonderful stories about it. It's dyed with vegetable dyes, it emits this particular fragrance. But the USP of it is that with the colors bleed. So every time you wash it, there is a different fabric, a different pattern. So Brooks Brothers bought the whole production and made all these sporty, Brooks Brothers is this iconic menswear label in America. And they made sporty jackets and shorts, and the baby boomers couldn't have enough of Bleeding Madras. But the care instructions forgot to mention this important thing about bleeding. So all the other fabrics, got the same color. And so, I mean, like then there was hell broke loose because it was America, right? Who sue at the drop of a hat. But Captain Nair distanced himself and he said, look, I had nothing to do with this. I told you. And instead he turned weakness into strength. So he had this advertising guru, David Ogilvy, who on the label said, guaranteed to bleed. So
Then there is another very interesting aspect that Captain Nair exemplifies, and that is political connections. He had very strong connections from Nehru to Sonia Gandhi, but it is not just the Congress. He had contacts with Pinarayi Vijayan, with Arun Jaitley in the BJP. So he covered all his bases, so to speak. And he believed, as Bachi writes in the book, net worth is enhanced by network. So there was this strong ability that led to the success, and this is a fact in the world. It's a fact very much in India that you need political blessings to, rise up in your business empire. So it is true he nurtured his contacts, but wouldn't you also say there was a skill in pleasing and greasing the corridors of power?
Yeah, I mean, he was an ace networker, no doubt about it. He knew everybody. There was nobody he didn't know. And I mean, even the way in which he reached out to me, a complete stranger, without any intermediate connection, was remarkable. I mean, he just picked the people he wanted to cultivate. And he did, in fact, do a remarkable job of it. So when you look at the way in which, as you said, he cut across the political spectrum, he grew up in Kannur, and his sympathies were very much with the left. And indeed, I think everyone knows that Pinarayi Vijayan is from Kannur, and that was a close association. But that didn't mean that the communists all liked him, because he fell afoul of the other rival communist leader in the CPM, Mr. Achyutanandan. And there was one case against him, it was filed by Achyutanandan's government, when he acquired the Leela in Kovalam, and the workers very lovingly transplanted 2 coconut trees without chopping them down, just lifted them up, transplanted them, and the case was filed against him. And when he was to be nominated for the Padma Bhushan, the Kerala government refused to nominate him on the grounds that somebody against whom a case was filed by the government cannot be nominated by the government. I did nominate him myself, and a few others did, and the Karnataka government backed him. He had already established the Leela in Bangalore, and he did win the Padma Bhushan. But the amazing story is that the poor guy was not backed by the very state and the very party that he was so loyal to. Having said all of which, it's also true that I think his networking wasn't only political. I mean, his networking in the business community was seen to be believed, right? And Bachi talks about how well he was at the business of actually extending hospitality, very often his own wife's cooking, to charm and woo people who were otherwise not inclined to do business with him, and how almost always it paid off. And there were some amazing things, again, which I'm amazed even occurred to him as a relatively young Indian starting out in business. tells the story of how he wanted to meet somebody who was staying at the Waldorf Astoria, and he deliberately books himself into a larger suite 2 floors higher and asks this guy to come up and see him. 5 floors higher. Well, there you are. Now, those are techniques that wouldn't occur to most of us, certainly not to me. But he managed, he had this gift, and it manifested itself in all these ways, and networking, as you said, was one of them.
But you had said right at the beginning that he was very rooted in Kerala. He loved his roots in Kerala. But maybe Kerala was not all that fair to him, right? I mean, and this is what happens with political connections. That's very good, but the political connections have their enemies, and those enemies become your enemies, and your rivals use those enemies to harm you, and therefore it can be, double-edged sword. So, would you like to say something about this?
Well, yeah, actually, you mentioned this about politicians, and the thing is that politicians worked against him and politicians worked for him. But somehow he, like Achyutananda, he was like his absolute bugbear. You mentioned Kovalam, his people went and, lay down on the beach and shouted slogans, which was really the opposite of the sun, sea and sand experience that he wanted to give his guests. But then he he sort of managed to get somebody higher. So when he was building the Bombay Hotel, this first hotel, Antule was the chief minister, and Antule kept on trying to damn him and slam him because Antule was, let us say, promoting the cause of the hotels which were actually in the south, the Taj and the Oberoi. And this man, again an example of his audacity, he was the first person who didn't build a Bombay hotel with a view of the sea. He built it in a place, Sahar, which nobody in real Bombay had heard of, but because the international airport was coming up there. And again, his wife, Leela, kind of saw this line of dusty taxis moving towards the airport and said, well, why don't we build an international hotel? And Vasant Dada Patil, another rival of also the Congress party, he became his great promoter and mentor. And he sort of said, whatever happens, I'm going to let you build it. So however much Antule tried to kind of put down his hotel, he ultimately did build it. It was the same with A.K. Antony and Achyutanandan. So he somehow managed it. When he wanted to give Kannur the airport, again, actually Pinarayi had been actually coming to power, the LDF, but then politics being what are politics, they had to leave power, and Achyutanandan, who was opposition, came into power, and he was his big, enemy. But again, Captain Nair had a higher authority, the aviation minister. So Praful Patel said, whatever happens, I'm going to give you the airport.
So we hear one side of the political connections, we never hear the other side of the political connections, the enemies and how they work to ruin you. When we talk of Captain Nair, we always think of the Leela Empire and the luxuries and his international jet set connections. But he began in very, very humble way. That is how poor he was, eating old rice. Can you just give us some few nuggets of incidents about how poor and backward his life was in the beginning?
Yeah, his father was really a peon, and in tax collection office, and only because of that he was allowed access into places which a low caste Banya boy, my man, would not be allowed. His mother used to sell coir, and then he would go along with his mother when she came into the main Kannur town to kind of sell the coir. He was the victim of a lot of caste prejudice because the Nambudiris would not allow them to walk on the same side as the pavement. But even as that young boy, he decided that he would continue to walk on the pavement, and if the Nambudiri boy was not interested in that, it was his business to cross the road. And that is exactly what happened. And yes, and he says that, I had this poor, the humble gruel, which, really the poor children have, that is leftover rice, in the water that has been cooked, and the next morning just mixed with fresh buttermilk and spiked with the brine of pickled limes. And I mean, that's what we had for breakfast. And he says, I think that humble gruel is what accounts for the brain and the brawn of all the Malayalis who have succeeded in life. And I'll just give you a diversion on this, this humble gruel. Just last week, a month, I was in Calcutta, and I was interviewing a lady who was the finalist of the Master Chef. And again, audacity. So the dish that she had decided to put forward was panta bhat, which is exactly this. Last night's gruel rice and served the next day. Though, of course, she spiced it up with some aloo and sardines and stuff like that. But this little humble dish, going back to her roots, is what kind of inspired the judges of MasterChef.
Shashi, Captain Nair also grew up and worked as a young boy during the time of the Malabar famine. Now, the Bengal famine is so well documented. There are Satyajit Ray films, and so much is known about this internationally. But the Malabar famine, unfortunately, is not so well known. Can you just tell us a few facts and figures of that time?
Yeah, it really was a rather tragic thing. In fact, if you go on Wikipedia and look for the Malabar famine, you won't find it. No one, hardly anyone has written about it. There are a few scholarly articles here and there. But there was a bad famine in Kerala at the same time as in Bengal, in both Malabar and Tiruvandagur in Travancore. And Krishna wasn't a boy. He was a young man who came and, in fact, had a responsibility in supervising the rationing. And the thing is that, you see, what happened was the British had basically converted a lot of our farmers into export crops, cash crops. So you didn't grow the stuff you wanted to eat and live on. You grew cash crops and sent it off, and you imported your rice from Burma. Everybody in Kerala was eating rice imported from Burma. But this was the Second World War, and the Burma fell into Japanese hands. So suddenly your entire source of rice dries up. And though we all have paddy fields and so on in Kerala, they accounted for a very small percentage of the actual demand for food. So when the rice dried up and there was no longer possible to make money exporting cash crops because the world's export markets were also affected by the war, famine was the result. And there was literally, I would guess, very approximately about 10% of the amount of food people needed was available in the marketplace. So inevitably, starvation, malnutrition, distended bellies, serious illnesses, deaths all occurred. The estimate in Malabar is about 10,000 people died, which is nothing compared to the millions in Bengal. So Bengal got all the attention. But that's partially because in Kerala, relief and rationing were organized immediately. And as we also saw with COVID and the pandemic, Keralites are not bad at coping with major grave challenges in organizing themselves. Now, Krishnan Nair, in charge of rationing and distribution of supplies, made a reputation for himself because of his integrity in keeping track of every bag of rice, literally, that could be available for distribution and ensuring it was fairly distributed. So that's how he became first somebody seen by his superiors as a person of exceptional competence and ability. And that, I think, stood him in good stead. But he's itching to say something.
Yeah, right. He was the rationing officer, and then he one of the guys whose business he was trying to ruin because he was very very honest. He kind of paid one of the laborers to throw a bag of rice on him so that he would be killed. But somehow he managed to dodge it and got the better of him. There was also a big black market in the sacks of rice which were being transported, and he managed to clean that act up as well. And just to tell you about how 300,000 truckloads of wagon loads of tons of rice used to come from Burma, and during the war that had trickled down to 10,000.
And I think you mentioned in your book that the price of rice went up 950%. It's a figure that we cannot even imagine. But if we can come now to some of the flaws and mistakes made by Captain Nair, what would you identify as his main flaws that led finally to the collapse of his empire?
I've written in this book that there are really two lines from poetry which sort of which typify what happened to him. One is vaulting, from Macbeth, vaulting ambition that overreached itself. And the second is the line from Yeats, the things fall apart, the center does not hold. So this is a man whose ambition really, really overreached itself. And he just kept on going into debt without thinking of the bottom line. So even when he sold Kovalam and he got those 500 crores, he didn't want to use it to service the earlier debt, but instead went and put it into his hotels in Chennai and Delhi. So rather than, borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, he created a third debtor who was Philippos, let us say. So that is really his vaulting ambition, which this one. But at the same time, he was also the victim of a lot of external circumstances. So Lehman Brothers collapsed in 2008. Then the Bombay, terror attack happened. Then came the economic downturn. So all the kind of strengths which he had built up. By then, you see, Captain Nair had died. So Captain Nair had all this political clout, and he could call in favors. He could tell the bankers, look, don't sell my hotel yet. Good times will come. His great philosophy was, this too shall pass. But now his sons didn't have the same kind of clout. So then he had a 5,000 crore debt. But I will tell you this, that from the jaws of defeat, the family did snatch victory. Because you see, they were very, very, honest and transparent in the way that they did that. So unlike, if I may mention another gentleman from these parts, Malia, Malia had a 7,000 crore debt. But you know where Malia is now? I mean, well, Malia is very comfortable, but everyone's trying to get him back. There was the Goyal, the jet empire collapsed. But all of them, these were great brands which fissioned. But the Leela brand has survived. Because this family, they decided that they would have transparency, they would have respect for their creditors, they would have a sensibility towards their employees. And so they kind of serviced the thing very, very carefully. And by the time they sold it to Brookfield, they had serviced their debt, they had managed to, establish their own separate empire. And the good thing was that when they had sold out, they had got their money and gone. But then the economic downturn happened, COVID happened, and you know that when the world economy, catches a cold, it's the hospitality industry which sneezes first. And so, these people had already got their money. And as I wrote in my book, that they may not have gone laughing to the bank, but they certainly went smiling into the sunset.
Thank you. In your book, one of the flaws, which is kind of a double-edged sword, is that he comes through as a person with a big ego. There's a lot of egoism in the man. So it's like that also propels great ambition, propels you to great success, but it can be also your downfall. So you quote him in the book as saying, I win, India wins. And this reminds me of D.K. Barua, the former congressman who said, India is Indira and Indira is India. Such grand statements never end well, do they? That is not an answer.
Well, in that particular instance, it didn't end very well, no. But I mean, in politics, as you know, one ending is never the last one. And though after Mr. Barua, 2 years within his statement, she was out of office, she came back 3 years after that. So was that an ending or was it a pause? But I think Bachi made a valid point about Captain Krishnan Nair, which is that at the end of the day, in a sense, liquidating when the family was obliged to might have been better than collapsing in the middle of the COVID pandemic when no one was visiting any of the hotels. And at that point, they would have been far more stretched than it would have been unsustainable, and they would have built up even bigger debts.
There is something in the book, an anecdote that you mentioned, which is very interesting, where in some sense, Captain Nair was seen as the great gambler because he was accumulating debt after debt. And there is incident with Raghuram Rajan, who was the former RBI governor, where he put his foot down and he said, no way I'm going to give any more debt to this man. And Arun Jaitley, who was Captain Nair's friend, was very upset and even actually says, you will see the back of this man soon. And sure enough, we did, because Raghuram Rajan was booted out. The point is that perhaps Rajan was right, because these debts were too big to be sustained. Therefore, the question then is that Leela Empire does not exist. Can you just tell us, Bachi, what remains of that empire and how are his sons and grandchildren all doing? Are they financially okay?
Oh, yes, they're financially okay because they got their money, they paid off whatever they had to. But, this empire has not really died because, whatever had happened through all the years of crisis, the brand had remained with the family. And the brand is what they really used, as leverage to get the kind of deal that they got from Brookfield. So if you see, the Leela brand has continued in all the hotels that exist. And the only hotel that they still have is the one in Bombay. But there's a Leela hotel everywhere, so I wouldn't agree with you and say that the brand has gone. They've all gone into hospitality. They've all been trained. In fact, his granddaughter, Samyukta, is kind of becoming the queen of Mayfair because she's building, restaurant after restaurant in the most fastidious food market in the world.
Yeah, I must say, when I was visiting London a couple of years ago, more than a couple of years ago, I was invited to this Yamavar restaurant, which it was described to me by my host as the best new Indian restaurant, etc. It was only later I realized it was Samyukta's restaurant. I'd known her as a little girl. So it's quite amusing to see how there's the new beginning rather than a...
And I think Samyukta has also acquired her grandfather's marketing skills. So, in fact, she said that to me, that, in everything about his empire, he'd be certainly interested in, in the architecture, in the planning, certainly the food, but in the marketing, he was right there in the center. And once, there was a photo shoot happening, and I think Vijay Amritraj was supposed to be, lobbing a ball in the, in the tennis courts of Kovalam. And the other partner didn't show up. So Captain Nair went up to his room, got into his shorts, and immediately, and see, in the book, his family pointed it out to him as to how he didn't have any ego about doing this. But I looked at it quite differently, that he actually wanted to be in the middle of that photo shoot.
Just one last question before we throw it open to questions from the audience. Captain Nair was also very good with alliances, seizing the opportunity, seizing alliances. So people have perhaps forgotten that he was a very famous and successful garment exporter before he became a hotelier. And he tapped into the garment export setup in New York. And that was run by the Sindhis. So when the Malayali mafia meets the Sindhi mafia, it's big time money. It really rolls. So then the thing is, now the Sindhi mafia had established itself exceptionally well in New York. And the reason I think is a bit curious, because the Italian fashion people, houses, dominate international fashion, also in New York. So, they have names like Armani, Giovanni, and so the Sindhis also have names which end in Ani. So suddenly you have Samtani and Murjani, but this tapping between Captain Nair and the Sindhi groups was very, very successful, made him a lot of money. He became India's leading garment exporter, and at the same time, also for many of his future, adventures, it's amazing how these Sindhi contacts came to his help again and again. So can you just tell about his ability to nurture these alliances?
Yeah, you see, he nurtured the alliances. He realized that, look, he can't fight the Sindhis, so if you can't beat them, join them, really. So he just took the little gaps which were there and used that gap to kind of not threaten the Sindhis, but get them onto his side. And you mentioned Murjani. Like, Murjani really was the person who tied up with Gloria Vanderbilt to create the first jeans designed for a woman. And he kind of, I think, quite happily allowed the misconception that Murjani was in fact the cousin of Armani. So he never really challenged them. And the wonderful thing is that because he had built these networks in his humble days, somehow there was a lot of serendipity which came to his fore. All these great books, all these empires that you read. I did a book on M.S. Oberoi, and even there, serendipity plays such a role. Suddenly someone you've known, 5 decades ago arrives and he's become a big man. So there was this Al Sandler who was just a salesman when even Captain Nair was establishing himself. But when he went back and wanted to build his war chest, to build the hotels, he told his son, now you reactivate my textile empire. And there this Al Sanders had become the big textile guy, and he kind of put him with Liz Claiborne, with all the other big designers. So I think somewhere or the other, his karma really paid off.
Great. Thank you, Bachi and Shashi. We'll take some questions now. Any questions? Yes, please.
Thank you, Pratap. Anita. Two questions. Hello. Two questions. One is taking Captain Nair to a higher level on what Bachi was talking about and all of you are talking about, his audacity. The Indian Army believes in risk-taking as a part of decision-making. So, my two questions are serious questions, sir. My first question is, as a politician, what do you think is the vision of India by India's leaders for the future? Is it just reacting to situations, or does it have a vision? And the second is, what everybody wants to hear from you, so please take it seriously. How do you wish to be remembered?
Me?
Yes.
Wow, I didn't expect that in this forum, but thank you. No, I think the problem with politics in most democracies is the tendency to think only as far as the next election. Short-termism is a besetting problem of all democratic politicians. And the politician who comes in with a longer-term vision is often tripped up by the reality that he or she has to be accountable to the electorate before that vision is fully realized. We've seen this in too many examples in our own country's democratic history. So I don't want to imply that it's linked to any particular leader. I would say that where this particular central government tries to prevail is in having an economic vision that can both be supplemented short-term with welfare measures and advertised long-term as showing a vision. That seems to be their approach. But that's been undermined, unfortunately, by a divisive and bigoted domestic agenda, which has vitiated the atmosphere within which all these visions could have otherwise been accepted. So where I part company with the government is precisely on the fact that I believe a visionary democratic leader ought to be thinking and speaking and encouraging forces that unite what we have, that unite us, that brings us together in what we have in common rather than divides us, as we've seen the present government doing. The second question is, I don't know whether you're getting me to be unnecessarily immodest, but I will say that I suppose if I have to ask myself how I'll be remembered, it won't be for any particular position I've held, because those are all transient. And even what you can accomplish through any of those positions can be overtaken by somebody else coming into that position. So I find myself sometimes saying, look, I'm already a former minister. One day I'll be a former MP, but I hope never to be a former writer. I think the best of me that will be available to be remembered will be my writing, my ideas, my thoughts, and what I leave behind. Thank you, General.
Good afternoon, Tharoor sir, Anita madam, and Bachi ma'am. Having worked in the Leela for close to 18 years and being closely associated with Captain Nair and his sons, I'm so happy to hear all those things that you had mentioned. I'm really proud. Thank you.
Yes, Anil used to work at the Leela Kovalam, where I knew him, and is now running the Leela in Kozhikode, in downtown.
Thank you, all of you.
I beg your pardon, the Ravis. But he came to the Ravis through the Leela, when Ravis took over the Leela. That's right. Yeah. Sorry.
Captain Nair built an empire and gave it his wife's name, Leela. And, generally it is said there is a woman behind every man's success. So I want to know, is his wife somebody who walked behind him, with him, or even ahead of him, showing him the way? Can you tell us a little bit about her role?
Oh, yes. I mean, I think Leela Nair was not just the wind beneath his wings, but she was the wings itself. And she was really like, Rider Haggard, she who must be obeyed. And if Leela Nair had a will, Captain Nair had to find a way. So can I just give them this little example of the lace? Very quickly. So Leela saw lace and she said, we must make lace. Now he was a textile, man, but I mean, a Malayali making lace, only Kerala nuns used to make lace and Parsi ladies wore them for their weddings, but there was no connection. So he said, now what to do? But his great mentor was V.P. Menon, who had all the connections. They had worked with 3 viceroys. So he said, if you have to make lace, you have to go to Scotland and London, in UK, and get the looms. So he goes there and he goes to this Sheffield loom making factory and says, can I buy your looms? So the English gentleman looks at him and says, well, why would I sell my looms to you? It takes 3 months to learn how to operate them. And he says, well, sir, if you don't mind, can I just borrow your telephone? And I will put you on to somebody who will vouch for me. So he dials a number, and guess who's at the other end of the line? Lord Louis Mountbatten. So when Lord Louis Mountbatten tells him, that poor man falls off his chair.
We can take one last question. No one has a question for Shashi?
There's a lady there.
As Gordon Gekko said, greed is good. I think Captain Nair also kind of endorsed that greed is good. Do you guys agree that money makes the world go round?
Well, no, I don't think greed per se, or greed unleavened by compassion, by, not humility. Certainly humility was not Captain Nair's thing, but I think compassion, because he really, I have a chapter here which says, a heart for all seasons. And the kind of compassion he showed to the, to his smallest employee, the kind of generosity that he had, and he had a very strong spiritual seat. In fact, he wanted to join Swami Shivanandan, and he went up to him and he said, can I join your ashram? But that man in his wisdom said, look, sitting Padmasan on the banks of a river is not your thing. You go out and be a karma yogi. And that is what happened. The Dalai Lama was his greatest pal. They used to have such shared jokes with each other. And he was, so not greed is not good by itself. No. Ambition, yes, but not undiluted greed.
So this book is called Capture the Dream, and it's a beautifully written book by Bachi, and it tells you really the importance of daring to dream, of capturing your dream. But as Bachi quotes Rudyard Kipling, it also warns you about not allowing the dream to capture you. So thank you all for being here with us today. Thank you, Bachi. Thank you, Shashi.
I think we'll be signing books immediately after, including my books, because unfortunately I won't have much time after my 2 sessions this afternoon, since I do have a flight to catch. So whoever wants a signature of mine, also come when you come to Bachi's signing. Thank you very much.